Hello everyone, welcome to September's reading wrap up. Where the hell did September go? It's gone so fast. I can't believe we're in October. I'm filming this like a week into October because I didn't see the date. I was like, oh, I need to put this video up soon. But welcome in. If you're a new viewer, welcome in. I review everything I read monthly. I'm feeling very grey today. It's very grey and it's been hard to like find a good lighting. I'm wearing double grey. I'm sat on what's not meant to be a grey sofa but looks very grey. Autumnal overcastness is in full swing. Anyway, let's get comfy and let's get reviewing. If this is the first video you're seeing of mine, I don't have a reading target this year. I decided against setting myself one because I just wanted to see where I could get without one. And I'm not buying any books this year, like spending any money on books. I am getting them free online, borrowing them off friends or taking them out of the library. The only thing that I have spent money on that's like book related this year that's for myself has been like library fines or reservation fees. I don't give books star ratings either. That's something I recently decided to do, well, this year for 2024 because I found it really difficult. I found myself like constantly referencing other books and being like, well, did I think it's better than that, blah blah blah, and I just think it's a bit more subjective than that, isn't it? So in September I read 7 books, which is about on track for me actually. I'm usually anywhere between 5 to 8 in a month. I felt like this month was better for me than August. I just felt more engaged with reading. I really struggled to read in August. I was very busy. I really struggled with the like books I read. I've just read a bad run of books that I didn't really enjoy, and you know, it just almost puts you in a reading slump. I did 4 audiobooks and 3 physical books this month, which is a bit wild for me. There was no digital books, and normally I've been quite like an avid Kindle reader, and actually my Kindle has not been charged. I've been doing a lot more audio lately because I have been commuting. I commute to go to work, not very long, but like a commute nonetheless, whereas before I would just be at work so quickly that I didn't often bother listening to anything. So I think in the morning I find it quite jarring to listen to music or like choosing what to listen to, so a book is just like easy to put on while I get ready and just continue until I get to work. I take notes on everything so that I remember to hit points. If you see me glancing down, that's why. So the first book was an audiobook. I listened to Midnight Feast by Lucy Foley. I would say it's a thriller slash horror, maybe. Very light horror. And I always give you just like a brief little synopsis of what the book's about. The manor is a posh, holistic countryside, seaside retreat that only the incredibly wealthy and incredibly privileged can afford, much to the disdain of the locals. It's opening night, and opening night is on Midsummer. And the next morning, the morning after Midsummer, the police have been called, the manor has been burned down, and a body has been found. If you know my reading taste, you know that thriller is not usually a genre that I would like necessarily reach for, especially not like in a physical book. It's not something that I would like necessarily choose first, but for the most part, this was very much an okay listen. I don't star rate books anymore, but I think if I was to star rate, this would like be firmly in like a 2.5 to 3 star, you know, just like a very mid-level, like okay book. Not terrible, but not particularly notable. And I do think, to be fair to the writer and the book, in large part this is due to me picking up a genre that I'm not usually like very hooked by or into. So I think if you like thrillers and you like murder mystery and you like a bit of light horror, you might enjoy it more than I did. I have picked up more thrillers this year, especially on audiobook, just in an attempt to like diversify my reading a bit, and also because a lot of them are really popular and they do get really highly reviewed, I don't want to like miss out on a genre. So this book had a multi-POV from like lots of different characters, which I have previously slated, but I am learning to enjoy it in an audiobook, and I particularly enjoyed it in this audiobook because this was a fully casted audiobook. So instead of one person doing like 10 different voices, this was like a different actor and narrator for each character, which actually makes things a lot easier to follow, and I thought all of them narrated really, really well. That was a nice touch, I think. And I listened to this on Spotify, so if you don't know, I didn't know, with your Spotify Premium you get 10 hours of audiobook listening time. Not sponsored, like not an ad. I just use that more, I think, than I use Spotify to actually listen to music. I was drawn to it because I quite liked the premise. It's very kind of like folky horror thriller, cult-like English countryside, folk horror elements, and folk horror is like usually one of my favorite genres in like television and film to consume, so I thought, why not? Because I thought this book was a bit meh, I don't really have like much to say on the content because I can't really remember. It feels like such a long time that I read it now, and I didn't really take notes at the time. I will say I feel like it has a few too many characters for me, even though I know I just said I enjoyed the multi-POV. I think you can still have too many characters in a multi-POV. It was more that the characters had a lot of like nicknames, name changes, some like integral to the story, some not so much. I personally found that confusing to follow, and I don't know if all of them were like entirely necessary. It was very twisty in the way a lot of thrillers are at the moment, you know, this kind of like Riley Sager twist after twist vibe that everyone always says they're not expecting kind of thing. They do always catch me by surprise. Am I surprised when there's a twist? No, but does the twist still get me to some extent? Like, yes, I would say so. Although I do think the ending felt a little bit unsatisfying. Generally, I would say this felt a little bit too slow and paced for a thriller, especially like in the midsection. But I would recommend listening over reading. I think if I was reading, I might have DNF'd this. I don't really like to read thrillers. I just much prefer to listen to them. I feel like the actors convey the pacing and kind of the tension well, whereas I don't think I get the same experience from reading. Sorry about the angle change, I can just never get it right. My second book was also an audiobook. I did this one on BorrowBox, not Spotify, and this was Mad Honey, and this was co-authored by Jodie Picoult and Jennifer Finney Boylan. This is a fiction, but it has some crimey elements in it, so I would say fiction / murder mystery. I do actually look up the genres of these books, by the way. I don't just make it up, but I go on what the main tag says, and then there's usually multiple tags for genre, so I just like add on a couple. Fiction is such a broad tag. So Olivia McAfee relocates from Boston to a small town called Adams with her teenage son Asher once she unfortunately discovers that her husband has a much darker side to him than she originally thought. In parallel to this, Lily Campanello and her mum have relocated to Adams for her last year at high school, with the intention that her last year at high school is going to be this amazing fresh start for her. Lily and Asher's paths cross and they fall in love, although Lily finds that she never really like 100% trusts him. Unfortunately, one day Lily turns up dead and Asher is being questioned as the main suspect in her murder. As the case unfolds, Asher's mother Olivia is finding it progressively harder to know what is the truth about her son. This book is categorically like not what you think it's about. The blurb does not allude to quite a vast portion of the subject content, the subject matter. An integral like twist of the book, but I do think it has the potential to be triggering. So I would consider looking up the trigger warnings. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the other trigger content in it in a second, not in any depth, but just kind of as like a note to the book. So just bear that in mind. This is quite difficult to review, and if you go looking for reviews, you almost certainly will encounter spoilers because it's really difficult to review without spoilering. That's aside, I haven't read a Jodie Picoult novel in years, since I was like easily 15, 16, 17. I'm not gonna lie, she wasn't on my radar. I didn't even know she was still writing. Obviously she would be, like why would she just stop? But I was surprised when I saw that it was charting on BorrowBox, and that's why I picked it up. I didn't actually realise it was a new book. I thought it was just maybe one of her more popular novels. On BorrowBox there's quite a lot of older novels that are popular. I don't feel like her writing style has changed hugely, and it had that kind of like nice comforting sense of familiarity to it from what I remember reading when I was a lot younger. So I will say one thing I did find is that this book was compelling. I found this a compelling listen. I always felt like she's done that quite well, specifically with me as a reader, is I always feel quite gripped. I always want to know what's happening next, even though I do think there was some pacing issues in this book and it's slowed down quite a lot. I'm not sure if the pacing was actually slow, or maybe if I should have listened on a faster speed, because the voice actresses actually had quite a slow cadence as well, and I think that combined with the prose made me feel like it was a really slow pace. Although having read some other reviews, I do think there was a pacing issue at some points in the book, so I think if you're going to listen on like 1.25. One thing I've always really admired about Jodie Picoult, and I don't really know much about her as an author, I haven't done much research into her, but she has never been frightened or shied away from writing about current events, taboo subjects, or politics. She writes about stuff that is like culturally relevant to the time. I think a lot of her books often contain like quite intense ethical dilemmas, or these really big think pieces, or things that as a reader allow you to like evaluate your own morals, or the situations will try to put you in someone else's shoes. And I think maybe now that a lot more writers try to do this, but I think like back when I was reading them, like over 10 years ago, I think these were it was quite shocking. I remember being quite shocked. I was quite young. I read a few that covered some really heavy topics. My Sister's Keeper being the biggest example that was made into a film. But yeah, I think I've always really, I guess, respected that about her. Whether you think her writing, her actual writing is good or not, I think her content is always going to be divisive, and it's always going to be taken to book clubs, and it's always going to be discussed at great length, and it's always going to prompt a conversation. I think for a lot of readers, Mad Honey will feel quite educational or quite impactful, but I can also see that it would bother a lot of people. And that's kind of what I got from the reviews, is that without giving too much away, it doesn't really give any kind of notion what this book is about. On to the next bit. I'm trying to be like quite careful about how I word this without giving it away and without sounding that I am not in support of the subject material of the book. So I will say, despite the fact that she is so adept at writing about like current social and political issues, I do think in this book it does feel like there's maybe a little bit too much like density of these issues. And I don't mean that she's talking about one subject a lot, because obviously it's a book, but it does feel like there are so many kind of, for lack of a better phrase, hot topics that have been crammed into the discussion of this book. It feels a bit dense at times. I'll list off just some of the themes covered that I can remember. Racism, homophobia, abortion, sexual orientation, and gender politics in like great depth, which is great. There's also quite a lot about rape, abuse, both emotional and physical, both on like adults and minors, same-sex marriage, great criticism of like the legal system and the justice system in America, suicide and politics just more generally as well. But having said that, ultimately this is a book about women's rights, so I understand it is next to impossible to have a conversation about women's rights without having a conversation about that list and all the aforementioned things that I just reeled off, because all of them are intrinsically linked. You cannot talk about one without talking about the other, without talking about the other, without talking about the other. But there is a point in this book I felt that it stops feeling like those things are important to the narrative and the story, and it kind of airs away from fiction and starts becoming like a non-fiction, and it starts reading as a non-fiction, and it almost takes on like a lecture-like quality. And I don't mean like a lecture like I'm lecturing you, although at some points it does have that, but I mean like a lecture like a seminar. Mainly when we reach like the courtroom and the trial portions of the book, understandably that's where it starts to feel like that, and I think that's where for me the pacing was slipping up a bit, and that's where I think it will be really educational for some readers who maybe don't have as much insight or haven't given much thought to those topics before. So that's a fairly minor criticism to the book, if I can even really call it a criticism, but I think some people will find it quite dense, some people will find it quite triggering, it's quite raw at points. Enough about the subject matter, let's talk about the writing, because I did actually enjoy this for the most part. I know it sounds like I didn't, but that's just like a discussion point I wanted to bring up. It was co-written by Jodie P and Jennifer Finney Boylan. I don't know much about Jennifer Finney Boylan, I've never read any of her previous work. When I listened to the author's note, I was wondering how it was co-written. Each character was a writer, so Jodie wrote Olivia's perspective and Jennifer wrote Lily's perspective. So at first their writing style seemed so similar, I couldn't separate it. They had a very similar like author's voice, but knowing that after reading it I can see a little bit more difference in the writing style. The whole book in tone and vibe was very atypical of Jodie Picoult, in that there is just so much hyperbole and like dramatic pause and dramatic prose and metaphor that I was a bit eye roll at points. Jennifer's portions were also so descriptive, more so than Jodie's, very flowery, very like lilting, poetic, dramatic type of writing, which I found quite difficult at times. Lily sounds like she's reading slam poetry like constantly, and I understand that she's like an angsty, dramatic teenager, but I was a bit like, wow, okay, this is a lot. It was a bit eye roll inducing at points. I wrote down a couple of things actually, because there was some bits that I absolutely lost it at. So there's a sex scene, it's not a spoiler, but she describes his dick as, and I literally went back into the book to find this, something raw and living that has just forced its head above the wet earth. That is a very strong visual, I think, of something that glistens a little bit. And I think she was, I haven't got it with me, but I think she was referencing that in terms of like grabbing it or holding it or like looking at it. Way too visual for me, made me feel really unwell. So another thing that took me out the listening, because I listened to the audiobook, I keep saying reading, but I did listen to this, was I was wondering if it was a UK versus US thing, but there was quite a few mispronunciations in the audiobook, and that's like a little bit of a pet peeve for me. So I did make sure to look up how these words were pronounced, at least in the UK kind of pronunciation. So that's why I'm going into this like quite lightly. If I'm wrong and this is in fact pronounced a completely different way in the US, I eat my words. It just took me out of the book. Eurydice, which I'm pretty sure I'm pronouncing it the right way, and I know that there is a lot of discussion around Greek words and pronunciation. I know there's usually several correct pronunciations, but I had to go back and then look at the scrolling words while I was listening, because I didn't understand what she said. Eurysturus? Eurysturus, that's literally how it was pronounced. I wrote it down in my notes because I was on the bus, and I wrote Eurydice ? And then I spelt it phonetically as how I heard it. It really took me out of the book. I know that's really petty. There was also another, I think it was centrifugal, like centrifugal force, and it was centrifugal, and I was like, it was centrifugal, and I just thought, I was like, but I don't know if centrifugal is actually pronounced like that in other places rather than centrifugal. I don't know, you know, and just that I'm easily bothered by stuff like that. I'm trying not to be petty, but it really took me out of my listening experience. I know it sounds like I really hated this book, and I'm looking on the screen and I've been talking about this for 18 minutes, so hopefully it won't be 18 minutes when I cut it down, but there was a lot for me to discuss. Overall, I had to pick in on the content and those kinds of things, because I cannot review this book too thoroughly without spoiling it completely, and if you've read it or listened to it or go on to, you will know exactly what I mean, or just go look at the spoilers. The characters did feel well developed in spite of what I'm saying, so I liked that. I felt like there was enough characters, not too many. There is timeline switching in this book, which I don't actually feel added much to the POV in the grand scheme of things. I think it just kind of furthers their twisty narrative. But I did appreciate the dual POV. I thought the two narrative voices were really quite distinct. The actresses who voiced them were really good, and yeah, I liked Lily and I liked Olivia, even though she was a little bit unlikable at points because she loves her son so much. Onto a physical book from the library. I read Alone with You in the Ether by Olivia Blake. Had to re-record that like 5 times to not say Olivia Blake. How annoyed must she be, everyone mispronouncing her name. This is literary fiction, and it is a romance in the loosest form of the word. Aldo is a doctoral student who manages his incredibly compulsive thoughts and destructive tendencies by constantly doing maths calculations in his head and obsessing over time travel. Regan is a bipolar artist undergoing court-ordered psychotherapy, and the two meet in an art gallery by chance. Or not by chance, that's the whole point of the book. This was so intense. I don't really know how to feel about it. Everyone I know that has read this loves this book. It came highly acclaimed, and they love their love story and they love the intensity of it. It's very, very character driven, so if you need some plot, you're probably not going to like this. I just know the start of this review is going to end up completely different to the end of this review, so I'm going to start with saying that I felt like they were the perfect pairing to begin with. And I know it's so obvious, but I felt like they were the perfect pairing. Regan is very, very compelling and very, very magnetic. And I know that's the point, and I'm just so drawn into Regan. And I think, unfortunately, I feel like Aldo is a bit flat in comparison, and maybe it's just because Regan like burns so brightly and is just has so much to her and is like so alive, and Aldo is in a different way. But I felt like we got more investment into Regan than to Aldo, and I know it's mainly about Regan, but I don't know, you know, and it's like, it felt like the classic example of like, he seems really mysterious and like stoic, and I think he actually just ends up being boring. I know Regan is not meant to be coming across a good person. That's like the whole crux of the book. She's not meant to be likable. She's flawed. They're both flawed, but I do end up quite disliking her quite a lot quite quickly. But I'm still ultimately really interested in her and like what happens. Although I haven't seen it in years, and maybe it's just my brain like compartmentalizing like two bipolar like female characters, but it kind of reminds me of Silver Linings Playbook in intensity and impulsivity of the characters and their love story. Probably in the same vein that it's about two very complex and vulnerable people, like very vulnerable people falling in love. As for the writing, I was really genuinely taken with it. It was such beautiful writing, especially in the beginning. Like, it was quite dense for me to read in that there's a lot packed into each sentence, but I was reading it and I was like, wow, I can see why this is so quotable, why people fall in love with the writing. I haven't read a book written like this in a really long time. Obviously does begin to border on pretentious. I know that's like a huge discussion topic of this book. It does begin to border on pretentious, but I think Regan and Aldo are a little bit pretentious. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I think it's this kind of like love story being very different to what a lot of romance and love story books are like now. So people are like kind of viewing it as pretentious. What's it called? Anti-intellectualism. There's a lot of like discussion about anti-intellectualism on TikTok and like book talk. I don't want to get into that, but I can see why some people would view this as pretentious. Do I think it's quite as pretentious as people are making out? I don't think so. I think it's just a stylistic thing. But I will say, after about 70%, I stopped enjoying reading it, like actually reading the words. I found it difficult to read. I understand that that's the point. We start a lot in one sentence and we end up on a completely different tangent and train of thought, and for my little brain at that time, I was muddling through it. It was really difficult. It obviously becomes quite incoherent. I understand that's like part of the journey that the book is on as well, but it was becoming dense to read, and it went a little bit too far and took a little bit away from my enjoyment. It lost me, and I do get that that's intentional. The incoherence and the franticness and the mania of the text is intentional, but I can see why people love this so much. It is so Tumblr. Like, it is Tumblr through and through. This is a Tumblr kind of love. This is a Tumblr kind of writing. And I don't mean Tumblr brackets derogatory. I just mean in that it is that indicative of that time. It's indicative of that love story. It's very, very, very existential. I think it just missed the mark for me. I would love this to have 10% more plot. I recognise that the plot thing is a me thing. I did not enjoy it. I just think it was obviously very hyped in my head and I was really ready for it. But yeah, just a smidge more plot I could have done without reading from like there onwards. I could have just left them preserved. I'm quite a simple girl with my romance books. I think I've moved away from angst and despair. I still love yearning, but I think I've grown out of trials and tribulations. Another audiobook for me for my 4th book of the month, and it was Her Majesty's Royal Coven by Juno Dawson. This is book 1 of the HMRC series, and this is, I'm gonna say, like a low fantasy, like an urban fantasy. So hidden in the government are a secret coven of witches. HMRC, very clever. Her Majesty's Royal Coven. Took me a minute to get that, I'm not gonna lie. Was a little bit embarrassed, but I thought it was clever. Anyway, they protect crown and country from all notions of evil and supernatural ill will. Their oracles at HMRC foresee a prophecy that will destroy the coven as they know it, and unfortunately at the centre of this prophecy are 5 best friends, witchy best friends. This book follows them. So do you know what I will say? This book has been haunting me. I've had all manner of targeted ads about this book and this series, and it's always at the top of my borrow box, and I guess the targeted marketing finally got me. I do really like the cover. I think the cover's like eye-catching, and I think that's why I always remembered it, that it was being targeted to me so much because of that. I thought what's the harm in listening to it? I have a lower threshold for audiobooks, I think, because I'm always going to be listening to them anyway. I don't like mind if they're not amazing. I'm willing to invest more into audiobooks. I think it's that I'm willing to take a chance more on audiobooks. To my elation, Nicola Coughlan was narrating it. Pen from Bridgerton. So instant plus points for that. Love her so much. Her accent made the whole thing really, really enjoyable, and she is so great at doing multiple accents, because there was Irish witches, there was Mancunian witches, there was witches from London, and she nailed pretty much all of them. There was a few like Lithuanian, Russian and Eastern European accents, and also a few like Caribbean accents that I thought were a bit rogue, but you know, you can't do it all. I don't usually like fantasy on audiobooks, so this is the first thing I will say. I have tried and failed, and I think it's because I can't see how things are written and spelled, but because this is a modern day, quite like an urban low fantasy set in London a lot of the time. It's not set in like the fucking Shire. It was easy for me to like pick up and follow. I think when it's like really period fantasy, it's really hard for me to grasp, especially when the spellings don't match up to how I think the names are pronounced, etc. So it was a very palatable listen. This is another book that I think I liked more because I listened to it. I think my view would have been very different if I'd have read it. So queer magic, very sisterly coven women, like girl power vibes. Lots of social issues in this book again discussed. Although, despite all of those things, I do think it just reads as a little bit almost young adult. I don't think juvenile is the right word or the fair word to use when describing this book, but the writing style is just like leaning towards a little bit of the young adult genre for me. It wasn't that it was bad, it was just that I wanted more from all of the characters. There was a lot of characters in this book. The book follows 5 best friends, and then obviously you've got all like the kind of like ancillary characters. I just felt like we didn't get enough time with all of them, and it still did feel like a really long book. I don't know, like the characterization just felt like a touch weak. So for some like examples, let me think. Leonie's this amazing witch who's like a queer witch, woman of color, and doesn't like how whitewashed and white HMRC is. So she like breaks away to found her own coven. This is not a spoiler, this is like pre-established in the book. She breaks away to form her own coven called Diaspora. But like we learn so much about that and like her reasonings for doing it and like her motivations and who she is as a person, like her values. And we just like never revisit that again. I know there's gonna be more than one book, but it felt like we did so much set up into Leonie and her values and who she is to just like never really see Diaspora again. The same thing about our villain in the book, who I'm not going to name, but our villain just feels like they go from 0 to 100. They're a little bit, like they give you the ick a little bit, and then all of a sudden they've just got these villainaic tendencies. I don't think villainaic's a word, but they just go so hard for their like villain origin story out of seemingly nowhere that it feels like almost unnatural, especially that you have the history of them. At the end, I was hoping we might get like a little bit of a reflection from said villain and kind of, you know, a little bit more humanizing. And I know not all villains need to be humanized, but this book is about like social issues, and there's a lot of human traits and like discussion on stuff like that in this book. So to have the villain just like essentially double down and like turn so evil, it just didn't feel, it felt a bit strange. It didn't feel right, like the characters don't feel explored enough. I think we should have also had more POV from Theo in this book. I don't think there was any POV from Theo, but given the issues that transpire, I think the perspective from Theo themselves would have been a good POV to have. So as someone that's not like easily triggered, I definitely did find the main villain's point of view quite uncomfortable to listen to. So I can imagine it being really triggering for some people. I was a bit like, oh, that didn't feel necessary. Slight personal gripe that I always find I struggle with, this is not going to be the case for everyone, is that I find pop culture references in books in excess difficult. They really take me out of the book. They always feel like slightly forced, I think. And this one had quite a few, like there was a lot of referencing to the Spice Girls. I just find that really tiresome. It's funny because I think all the characters in the book are like more or less supposed to be the same age as me, so that should technically make it more palatable, but it's just a personal thing. I really struggle with it in previous books. Again, this is a review that comes across as quite critical, and it's not supposed to be inherently critical. I just pick up on these kinds of things. So I will be listening to the second book. At the time of recording this, it's actually in my October reads, so I have listened to the second book. The audiobook experience has made me enjoy it a lot more, and I really think Nicola Coughlan is so good, and like impeccable accents and a great storyteller. I feel like September reviews all sound really negative, but actually I think I had a much more successful reading month this month. I just think maybe I'm like feeling a bit more chatty about the books. I guess maybe my reviewing skill has like improved over the years, and I have like more nuanced stuff to say now. I don't know. I used to be quite scared to review books critically because I don't want to make anyone feel bad, but I did not like it. I just think those are all things worth noting. My next read was a physical book, and it was Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. This is sci-fi, and I got this out from the library. Our male main character, Charlie Gordon, has been born with an unusually low IQ, and as a result of this, he's been selected as like the perfect candidate for an experimental surgery that is designed to increase your intelligence. Scientists believe it will increase his intelligence anyway, and this has been successfully performed on a mouse previously called Algernon. That's Algernon. So Charlie's intelligence starts to surpass everyone's around him, including the scientists, including the surgeons, and his life changes. But one day Algernon starts to deteriorate, and Charlie is like coming to terms and left to come to terms with the fact that this is probably going to happen to him. I have so many thoughts, so much to say about this book that it like renders me a bit speechless. I put this down and I finished it, and I just turned to Doug and I just went, oh my God. I was like, slack-jawed. I've written thoughts on it now, but I didn't even know like how to process. I think this is like profoundly impactful. I didn't cry, which a lot of you DM'd me on Instagram like prepare for tears, and I'm a crier. I spread it out quite a lot across quite a long period of days. I was reading like not very much at a time. I think if I'd have read it all at once, I would have wept. I can absolutely see why this is so popular. So many of you messaged me about this, and it's been on my list forever. I've actually been looking at it for like a year in Waterstones. The only thing that ever put me off is I don't really love the cover. So I saw it in the library and thought I'll take it out and borrow it. I think the reason I didn't cry is I was just reeling when I finished it. To get into the thoughts, unbelievably vast range of emotions while reading this that I was quite surprised at. Surprised at in the sense that I felt like it really snuck up on me. I didn't start feeling invested in Charlie or really kind of like any strong emotion about it until about halfway through. I was quite neutral. I was just reading it. And about halfway through, I started being like, okay, I'm feeling. Charlie's memories are so heartbreaking. His experience at the bakery viewed through so many different lenses of intelligence, and his realization that people were never really his friends, people were like making fun of him. Oh my god, that's just like the most heartbreaking thing, because we knew that as the reader, right? One thing that really stuck out to me was Charlie's love for Alice not wavering across like all states of his mental capacity, and like how pure it was at points, and like the simplicity of their feelings for each other, but the difficulties in timing. And I know like right person, wrong time is such a tried and true romantic trope, but it just eats every single time. And I think what's different about this is there was so many opportunities for the timing to be right, but we were never in that time period long enough for them to work out, because Charlie's intelligence was either always waxing or waning and surpassing what made them a good match. That was like so heartbreaking to me, because like Alice loved him for like purity of soul, and obviously her love like develops, doesn't it? Because when she was like caring for him, that was a very different kind of love. I'd like to imagine that that was like a platonic, a nurturing, like a motherly kind of love. So I was actually quite interested that that did manage to evolve into like a more romantic place. Right person, wrong time was like a really effective formula in this book. And yeah, it was just heartbreaking. And like even he gets more intelligent, she can see like all the problems with that for them, and he can't, because he just thinks like intelligence is like the highest value. Oh my god, it actually like gives me goosebumps a bit, because I like love. I wish I could have highlighted, and I was tempted to with a pencil for the next reader, because I think highlighting in library books is really powerful. I'm tempted to start leaving notes on my thoughts on this in books. I feel like if I had Goodreads or something, that'd be like quite a good advertising for Goodreads, but I don't know. I like keeping things that are left in library books, so to leave something in a library book seems like a nice idea. Anyway, I got distracted. As his intelligence starts to wane, it says, "But what we have, I suspect, is more than most people find in a lifetime." That like knocked the fucking breath out of me, I'm not gonna lie. So I can see why this is considered a classic. And there's a quote on the back from Will Wheaton that says, "Heartbreaking and beautiful, required reading as far as I'm concerned." And I am categorically, absolutely inclined to believe that. I think everyone should read this. I think it should be required reading. I do think when I picked it up, I was a little bit exasperated, because one of the indicators that his intelligence is progressing and changing and evolving throughout the book is that these progress reports are written with like very bad grammar, very bad spelling, and they obviously get progressively better throughout the book, which is really interesting, and I think like quite a nice touch. But when I first read the first page, I thought, oh, because that's like quite a lot of effort to read stuff that's spelt incorrectly. But I was taken by surprise. I ate my own hat on that. That was quite rude of me to think that, I think. I don't know, it's just such a commentary on so many things, isn't it? Like there was so much covered in this book, mainly like learning disabilities and like where people go who are unable to find their place in typical society, like living in deprivation, the loneliness of intelligence, like the complexity of emotional intelligence, that like book smarts and emotional intelligence are two very different things. Human connection, there's just like so much hope, and there's also so much despair. I don't think it's aged very well in terms of terminology, but this is indicative of the fact that it was written 40 years ago, if not more. When was this written? Okay, 40 years is an understatement. It's written in 1960. I keep forgetting we're not in the year 2000. The R slur being used like constantly and consistently made me so uncomfortable. It is obviously used as like medical terminology in this book. That was the correct medical terminology at the time, but I think where I'm just not used to that, it was a really, really uncomfortable read at points. It is very much a slur. It just made me cringe a lot, so that's just like something to bear in mind. Charlie losing his warmth and like his personableness and his likability as he gets more intelligent is so interesting to me when I was reading it. His character reads as so cold and so unlikable, and it becomes very frustrating to read his diary entries. Like, there was points I was not rooting for Charlie anymore. You start to resent him so much, and then you go through so many different emotions when you realize like the really subtle things in his diary entries. So like some incorrect sentence structure, or some like missing grammar, or like a missing apostrophe. It's like quite subtle at the beginning. I don't really know what to say about it other than how much this book has stuck with me, and I've thought about it often since I've read it. I don't know if this is classed as one of my favourite reads, because favourite is such a funny word, isn't it? But I would say that it could make it onto that list purely based on the impact that I felt like reading this has had on me. It's been a while since I've read a book that's given me feelings like this. I never collect quotes from books, but this one stuck out to me as well, and it's, I don't know what's worse, to not know what you are and be happy, or to become what you've always wanted to be and feel alone. Just wow, that book really did a number on me. I would recommend reading it. It's not very long. Next up was another audiobook. This was a Spotify audiobook, and it was Death of a Bookseller by Alice Slater. I'm gonna say thriller/crime. So Roach is a bookseller and a true crime obsessive. She looks down on normies and people who only like true crime because it's trendy and it's like in at the moment, it's the done thing. So when a new bookseller joins her Spines branch, Spines is the bookshop, Roach attempts to bond with her over true crime, but cannot seem to grasp why Laura is keeping her at such arm's length. When Roach learns a few more details about Laura and her seemingly traumatic past, Roach becomes obsessed with her. I really liked this. I think it is so funny, and I don't mean funny like haha funny. It can be at some points, but I feel like it's got this weird dark humor, like satirical element to it, especially when it comes to like how Roach perceives herself and the world around her. Like, it's such an eye roll that Roach is like, I'm not like other girls, and it's almost so played up that Roach is so like, I love murder, I love true crime, like I hate other girls, that it's like a joke, you know, when it's so played into it that it's funny. I mean, I guess that's the point, because it's like if someone was like that in real life, it would be like a real concern, but because of the way it's written and it's from the POV, and I think there's something funny about it to me being like very UK based, she's insufferable, and obviously it's concerning, and I think that's what makes it quite darkly funny and entertaining. I'm not saying the whole book is a laugh, because it's not, but there's moments where you just think, oh my god, I'd fucking hate you, Roach. Roach and Laura at the start feel very opposite. Like, they feel so opposite that you think like, of course they don't get on, like of course they're rubbing each other the wrong way. But I think the more you listen, you feel quite compassionate for them both in varying levels, but you realize there's like parallels and they're slightly more alike. This is definitely a thriller to varying degrees at different points. There's some bits where it feels a little bit like not quite so thrilling, not quite so tense, but I was like, how the fuck does this play out? I would like this to be a little BBC 6-parter, 4 parts maybe. 4 parts or 3 would be enough, but I think it would be done really well. It was very atmospheric. I think for me, why a part of this resonated so much with me as well is that this tonally and atmospheric wise really captures being a retail worker in your early 20s around Christmas and winter. There was just something about the scene setting, the fact that they were almost always hungover, like the going out drinking, the having no money, the despair, the fancying someone on your team, the constant pub trips, like the dank darkness of it all. It was like, that really resonated with me, because it reminded me of when I was like early 20s working Christmas, and you're just like doing what you need to do to survive. Do you know what I mean? Like, you just go in so hungover, like super chipper. It felt so familiar from that aspect. This book is obviously intending to prompt a discussion around the ethics of consuming true crime content. I think Alice Slater has handled that discussion well, and in a palatable way that won't automatically make people feel defensive for enjoying true crime content, because I've noticed when I've tried to have this discussion with people, it can come across as a bit like holier than thou, and that's not my intention. Roach is obviously not a good example of someone that likes true crime, because not everyone that likes true crime ends up being fucking crazy. I think what I liked about it is it sparks a thought process and an internal conversation for me, which is something I've been trying to like engage with for a while but find it difficult to engage with online. And basically I thought that Alice Slater, the author, had a very tactful and light-hearted way of bringing it up, and I admired the way she opened up the floor to that discussion, because obviously that's kind of what the book is about. I really liked Laura's character, as flawed as she is. I was a bit gagged by the ending. I'm not sure what I was expecting. Obviously it's a thriller, so I want to know now. Yeah, it does get very, very tense. I did really like it. I would recommend listening to it or even reading it. Has a lot of mixed reviews online, which surprised me. I thought more people would like it. I think Roach's character is polarizing. My final read for the month was a physical book. It was another library book, and it was Chlorine by Jade Song. LGBTQ plus fiction / body horror, ? Light body horror. Beautiful, beautiful cover. It's not often that I pick up a hardback. Been on my list for ages. Our main character, Ren, is a competitive swimmer, and she lives at the pool. Her day begins at the pool and her day ends at the pool. So she's in high school and she wants to be scouted by college scouts. She wants to be the best on her team. She wants to be the fastest on her team. She wants her coach to be proud of her. She wants her parents to be proud of her. Hashtag just girly things. But these are all the concerns of a regular high school human girl, and she just dreams of a life where she can be free in the water and in the chlorine. I enjoyed this a lot more than I thought. Definitely felt like I read it a lot faster than I've been reading lately. It is just over 200 pages, so about 215. Recently, I've really struggled with books that are based in metaphor or that are very symbolic. So when I was reading it, I felt a bit hesitant, but this wasn't the case here for me. This is a horror in like the lightest sense of the word for me. So it's kind of like body horror. It's very like literary horror. It's not got too much body horror in it. There's definitely some graphic moments, and it's not like a huge portion of the book. I think primarily this is about the pressures that are put onto young athletes, and it's very much like a coming of age. Naturally, within coming of age, this encompasses like sexuality, race, mental health. I have a real soft spot for books that talk about the struggles of coming from like an immigrant family. It just always really resonates with me, and while for the most part it's not been my experience because my immigrant mother passed away when I was younger, it's always like a very comforting read. It's like reading a little glimpse into my own home, like regardless of the culture. Basically what I'm trying to say is that's always a soft spot for me. I liked this because it had that tone of obsessive that I really enjoy in a book. I really like themes of obsession. It was slightly deranged. The narrator was unreliable at times, and at times very unlikable as well, which I also really like. The writing left a little bit to be desired at points, but I was unsure if this was just because we're reading from the perspective of a teenage high school girl, so I kind of excused that. I'm not gonna lie, I'm the kind of person I will excuse bad writing, especially if it's like from a teenager, because I forget that obviously the author is in control of the words. I find it easy to forgive, so I don't know if this will be a bother to some people. I think some of the sentences were like a little bit clunky and could have been said in less words. There was a few moments of like big words, and I know that sounds really condescending, but you know, when you feel like it just wasn't a good fit for the sentence, like the word was too big. I really liked the folklore and the historical aspects because there was a lot about mermaids in this. There was a lot of referencing of mermaids from like different cultures. When I was younger, one of my favorite books was the Hans Christian Andersen's Little Mermaid, which is like a lot darker, and I have a book of Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales that I just reread cover to cover to cover. So again, that kind of had like an element of familiarity and comfortingness in it that I know. That bit was enjoyable. I enjoyed like all of those mermaid references because I could actually recognize where they came from. I don't really love epistolaries, so I found the letters a little bit distracting, and I don't really think they added a lot until the very end, but that's such a minor thing. I think it was all right. I haven't read something like this in quite a while, so that was a nice change. I feel like that was the most chatty and rambly and nonsensical and contradictory monthly reading wrap up I've done in a while. So I hope that when I edit this, it's easy and it made some semblance of sense to you. I think what I struggle with is feeling like I'm contradicting myself. So I do constantly talk about how I hate epistolaries and multi-character POVs. And then I find myself being like, oh, I really enjoyed that about this book, or one of my favorite reads recently being epistolary. It's okay, it's not contradiction, it's growth, and there is exceptions to every rule. I don't set myself rules. But yeah, I think all of the books that I read in September prompted a lot of conversation for me, as is apparent in the length of this video, I'm sure. But I think there was a lot of thinking and processing to be done around a lot of them for me. I don't feel like these come across as really negative. I do think that sometimes it's easier to focus on the things I didn't like about a book than I did like. So I'm gonna try to write my ideas down and my thoughts down as I finish them to hopefully capture some more of the positive themes of books, because the things that usually stick out to me that I remember a month later when reviewing are things that are maybe like a bit negative or could seem like I'm criticizing them. But yeah, as usual, I'm just always overthinking it and overthinking my capabilities as a reviewer, so please just ignore me. I don't have a Goodreads, but I do have a story graph, and that's where you can see all my lists and like my TBRs and everything. You can add me on there, and then I post my reads on Instagram as well. Thanks for watching. If you made it this far, it was great to hang out with you today. Don't forget to subscribe or leave a comment or drop a little like. That would really help me out, and I will see you on the next video.